Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Jon Fosse's monumental work, Septology, translated from the Norwegian by the inimitable Damion Searls. Septology has been published in 3 different volumes over the past few years, and it's certainly Jon Fosse's magnum opus, at least for now. And of course, it's translated by one of the very best translators from Germanic languages, Damion Searls. Apparently, Damion Searls learned Norwegian just so he could translate Fosse, by the way. Apparently, after he convinced a publisher to let him co-translate Melancholy, he had to learn the language, and he learned it while translating Fosse. And I'd be lying if I didn't say up front that one of the reasons why I'm learning Norwegian right now is so I can read Jon Fosse in the original. So I will spare you my awful Norwegian in this video and just focus in on Damion Searls' English translation. I think it's worth spending a bit of time to introduce Jon Fosse and his bibliography and his style, because I suspect that a lot of new readers have come to Jon Fosse after he was nominated for the International Booker just earlier this year. I was introduced to Jon Fosse through his earlier work, which was published throughout the mid-2010s, called Trilogy, which is essentially 3 novellas put together, though he does have an extensive backlog going back decades. I started with Trilogy, I think in 2016 or 2017, before going through his backlog, and reading it, I was just completely blown away, because it's such a simple and quiet story that often reads like a biblical parable at times. But the narrative voice and the writing style is just outrageously gorgeous in its simplicity, in its repetition, its dreaminess, in its stripped to the bone minimalism. It was unlike anything else that I have read up to that point. His prose is the exact opposite of what you would find in what has now been called hysterical realism, and that kind of exuberant and manic prose that kind of dominates late 20th century, early 21st century literature, especially American literature, and which I do like quite a bit, don't get me wrong, but where these authors sort of fear silence and they fill in silence with this manic prose. Fosse writes about quiet contemplation and silence better than any other writer I've read. His characters do speak to each other, but it's really in what they don't say, in their silences, where the real meaning often lays. Fosse uses an incredibly simple vocabulary. He rarely abides by any rules of grammar. You'll be hard-pressed to find a full stop in any of his novels. He's a writer who knows and wields the power of minimalistic but lyrical language to convey deep, deep meaning. He, like Cormac McCarthy or Laszlo Krasznahorkai, doesn't need grammar to give his prose rhythm. His language alone does that, and Septology is perhaps the apex of this style. Jon Fosse is not only one of the most important voices coming out of Norway in the late 20th and early 21st century, but I'd argue that he's one of the most important contemporary literary voices. Nobel Prize Committee, I'm looking at you. While he's only really recently emerged and come to prominence in the Anglophone world, he's not an obscure writer by any means. He has published dozens of novels and I think over like 30 plays. He's literally the most staged living playwright in Europe right now. Never mind the countless literary theory essays and poems that he spent a good portion of his early career writing. As seems to be a recurring problem, the Anglophone world is far behind the larger global literary world. So make no mistake, this isn't a book for Anglophones to pick up and learn a little bit about Norwegian culture. This is a modern classic that I suspect that we'll look back on in the same way that we look back on Samuel Beckett's trilogy. In Septology, Fosse takes a fairly well-trodden trope of exploring a character's interiority through stream of consciousness prose, but he manages to make it feel completely fresh. There are echoes in Septology of Beckett, the writer whom Fosse is most often compared to. But Fosse isn't just Beckett reincarnated. Fosse's voice is utterly unique. Fosse was born in 1959 in the west of Norway, and he writes in Nynorsk rather than Bokmål. Nynorsk is the kind of less popular Norwegian language. It's less popular in eastern cities like Oslo and more in use in the rural parts of the west coast. But it's a language with a very long literary history. Authors like Tarjei Vesaas and Olaf H. Høyge wrote in it. And Fosse has similarities to both of those writers in his use of understatement, in his simple diction, in his quiet, contemplative tone. But even within Nynorsk, Fosse's prose is quite unique. He writes in what he calls langsom prosa, or slow prose. And his works are slow and careful and repetitive, and they really force the reader to face their own consciousness as they're forced to slow down and to slow down your brain and really just focus in on his langsam prosa. I'll talk more about why I think he does this and the effect that it has in chapter 7. One more important biographical note before we dive into septology. Fosse converted to Catholicism quite late in life, which is something that he shares with the main character of Septology. And I only mention this up front because this conversion to Catholicism specifically is very important to the themes of this book. Fosse grew up in what he calls Norwegian Puritanism, which, as far as I can tell, based on how he describes it in an essay called Negative Mysticism, which is collected in this essay collection that I'll come back to in just a little bit, called An Angel Walks Through the Stage. It's a very undogmatic form of Quakerism. It's a whole thing, and I won't get into the specifics. But suffice to say, Septology is very interested in religion, in Catholicism specifically, but kind of in a more spiritual or a more mystical way. Either way, this is a religious book, perhaps one of the most powerful modern religious books that I've ever read. But don't let this scare you away if you're not religious. I'm not religious at all, but it didn't really hamper the power of this book. In fact, rather than religion per se, I would say that Septology is much more interested in mysticism than anything else. This, of course, goes hand in hand with Catholicism, as I'll talk about later. But Fosse has described his writing as a kind of mystical realism, not magical, but mystical. And he views his job as a writer to be a kind of mystic. More on all of this in chapter 5. So 2 more quick notes before we dive into Septology. I'm going to be referring to this book as a single book, as Septology. And as such, I'm going to be drawing from all 3 books, but I'll try my best to avoid major plot spoilers. But this really isn't a book that you can spoil. Like in Meditation, the power of this book doesn't lay in its end product or in the result, but in the very present experience of reading it. Septology was published in English and Norwegian as 3 different books. And of course, as its name suggests, it is made up of 7 individual parts. And while the numerology of these 2 numbers are obviously quite important for its Catholic themes, in my mind, this is a singular work and should be read and treated as such. And last note, I always want to be honest, and so I'll note up front that I don't fully understand this book. In fact, this book is in many ways about not understanding. It's about the mysterious and the inexplicable, and that which cannot be understood. So just like with Gerald Murnane, whom I reviewed earlier this year, I think that it's worth saying here that any real attempt to fully encapsulate this novel or fully explicate on it is not only a fool's errand, but one that seems counter to its main themes. It's, in a way, contrary to the very conceit of the book itself. So if you're looking for answers, I can't help you, but I hope in this video to outline some ideas and some questions that I think are worth exploring and asking about septology. For the sake of organization, I split up this video into 7 thematic chapters for reasons that I hope are quite clear. I'm sure there will be a lot of overlap between chapters, but enough preamble. The story or plot here on the surface is incredibly simple, but just underneath the surface lays something much more complicated. Septology takes place over the course of a few days right around Christmas, and is about a man named Asle, who is an aging and relatively successful painter who lives just a couple hours north of the city of Bjørgvin, in this very small town called Dulia, and he has to drive into Bjørgvin quite frequently to drop off paintings at this art studio where he displays his paintings and sells them. These names, by the way, are very interesting. The town named Dulia, I presume from the Old Norse verb dulia, meaning to hide or conceal, and Bjørgvin from the Old Norse name for the city of Bergen. These small details go a long way, I think, because every time Asle drives into Bjørgvin, it's like he's driving into the past. But these names, I think, also place the world of this story in a world that is almost like our own, but just a bit different. It's a world that is not quite our own. There is this atemporality to all of Fosse's novels that I've read, as they rarely include hard evidence as to when exactly they're happening. And this simply adds to the mythical and kind of mystical atmosphere of each of his books. The world of septology is undoubtedly our world. It probably takes place somewhere in the late 20th, early 21st century. But there is a veil over this world, and it feels just a bit different. Anyways, Asle has a friend in the city, another man named Asle, who looks exactly like him, and is also a painter, a kind of retired painter. This Asle is struggling with alcoholism, and our narrator Asle really wants to help this Björgvin Asle, but really can't get through to him. This Asle, the one in Björgvin, has been twice divorced and has children whom he almost never sees. And he's really struggling. For much of Septology, this Asle is hospitalized due to alcoholism. As you can surely see, the line between these two Asles is very faint and at times non-existent. And this is really the main question of the plot of this book. Who are these two Asles? Are they the same person? Are they different versions of the same person? How is this working? Asle, the narrator Asle, whom I'll refer to as the narrator Asle or the first Asle, as it's his voice that's in the first person and whom we see almost everything in this book from the perspective of. He also has another friend nearby called Asle, whom he doesn't really like, but they get along well enough, and their interactions add a nice touch of humor to an otherwise very melancholic book. And the narrator Asle himself is a recovering alcoholic, and he's a recent convert to Catholicism. He's also a widower. His wife Alice has died, and it's to her and to their memories that Asle's mind turns to the most. I should also note right here, as it might not be clear in audio, that Asle is spelled A-S-L-E and Alice is spelled A-L-E-S. They're quite close to each other, of course, and Fosse is always playing with names, as so many characters in so many of his books have the same name or very, very similar names. Names are obviously quite important to this book, as is the themes of doubling and of doppelgängers that we'll get to in just a minute. The second book in Septology delves more into Asle's childhood, and the third book looks a lot more at his early career and his marriage to Alice. And throughout all of these books, there is a more general plot that does drive a lot of the narrative of Asle trying to convince Asle to finally come spend a Christmas at Asle's sister's house. She lives on an island just off the coast. But with the kind of general plot out of the way, most of this book takes place in Asle's head, as he's remembering all of these memories as he goes about his daily life. A significant portion of the first book, for instance, takes place on his drives into Björgvin to drop off or pick up paintings. So as you can probably see, this whole novel is very existential in tone and subject matter, as Asle is constantly contemplating his entire life, his regrets, his own past, all the while trying to come to terms with the fact that he is very much alone. And so with all of this in mind, I must say Septology isn't a plot-focused book at all. There isn't necessarily an external conflict that Asle is dealing with, but very much the internal conflicts pertaining to his own loneliness and his impending death. So I won't say too much more about the plot of this book. The plot isn't really what matters here in Septology. Let's move on to Asle's art. And I see myself standing and looking at the picture with the two lines that cross in the middle, one purple line, one brown line. It's a painting wider than it is high, and I see that I've painted the lines slowly. The paint is thick, two long wide lines, and they've dripped where the brown line and purple line cross. The colors blend beautifully and drip, and I'm thinking that this isn't a picture, but suddenly the picture is the way it's supposed to be. It's done. There's nothing more to do on it. I think it's time to put it away. I don't want to stand here at the easel anymore. I don't want to look at it anymore. This is how every single one of the 7 volumes of this novel begin, with Asle seeing himself stand in front of this painting that he recently finished and contemplating it. Painting specifically and art, capital A art, are incredibly important to the themes of this book. This is what Asle has dedicated his life to. But at the opening of the first book, he's really beginning to struggle with his art. He's unsure if he wants to continue painting or if he's done. This painting, the one that adorns the cover of the 3 books, is called by his friend Asle St. Andrew's Cross. And it's this single painting, the one of 2 lines crossing, that he contemplates throughout this entire book, whether it's good enough, whether it's finished, whether he needs to revise it or readorn it in some new way, whether he should give it away or whether he should keep it, whether it's garbage or his masterpiece. And so this painting, again, like the covers suggest, really give this novel its structure. It's this painting, the one of 2 lines crossing in the middle, that everything in Septology orbits. So much of this book is an exploration of art and why we create art. And Asle has some very specific reasons for why he creates art. As you can tell from St. Andrew's Cross, Asle isn't interested at all in what we would call realism. There's an ongoing conversation in this book about why Asle has moved from realist paintings to these more abstract paintings. Like Picasso, Asle's early art was hyper-realist. They were of people, of horses, of landscapes. But the paintings that he became famous for later on in life, and the ones he paints the most of now, are these more abstract paintings. He's lost the ability or the desire to simply replicate reality. And now his paintings solely convey feelings and emotions. And through their conveyance of feelings and emotions, they convey meaning. And also has some very specific and kind of odd reasons for why he paints. But when I paint, it's always as if I'm trying to paint away the pictures stuck inside me. Yes, the ones like this picture, of him and her sitting there. To get rid of them in a way, be done with them. I've sometimes thought that that's why I became a painter, because I have all these pictures inside me. Yes, so many pictures that they're kind of an agony. Yes, it hurts me when they keep popping up again and again, like visions almost, and in all kinds of contexts. And I can't do anything about it. The only thing I can do is paint. Yes, try to paint away these pictures that are lodged inside me. There's nothing to do but paint them away, one by one. This idea I just find so interesting, that by painting, he's expelling these memories, these thoughts, and these feelings. Because I think we often think that visual arts do the exact opposite, that they capture these memories and these thoughts and these feelings, and making it more eternal. For Asle, though, art isn't a means to capture truth, but a means to expel it. And it's not quite that simple either, as throughout this book, he's constantly thinking about and debating whether he should get rid of these paintings, if he should sell them, or if he should keep them for himself. So they do contain truth in them, but Asle is never sure if he wants to hold on to it or send it out and away from him. And in fact, one of the main plot points that I mentioned earlier is Asle, his neighbor, trying to convince him to go and spend Christmas with his sister. This is a recurring thing. Asle tries to get him to go every single year, but Asle always refuses. And instead, in his stead, he sends one of his paintings with Asle to give to Asle's sister. This year, however, Asle is really considering going. And one of the main reasons why he's really considering going is because he wants to go to Asle's sister's house to see all of the paintings that he's given to Asle's sister over the years. He wants to revisit them all one last time. The most interesting painting in this book is, of course, St. Andrew's Cross, the one that adorns the US copies of these books. Importantly, Asle didn't name this painting St. Andrew's Cross, but his neighbor Asle did, as when Asle saw it, the only thing that he could think of was something that he's seen before, St. Andrew's Cross. Still, the Catholic symbolism is obviously quite pertinent, and I'm sure you could read a lot into the specifics of the martyrdom of St. Andrew and the Catholic traditions that grew up around this saint, among plenty of other things. But I think it's worth pointing out that, if it's not clear already, that this single painting holds the key to this entire novel. It's a painting that demands an ekphrastic interpretation. It's simply a painting where two lines begin on their own, slowly moving towards each other before crossing briefly and then continuing on their own paths, never to cross again. Septology is full of characters doing this exact same thing. Two lives coming together and briefly, for a moment, crossing and blending into each other, and beautifully creating something new by this union before they split apart and go on their own ways, forever changed by their crossing. We see this with Asle and Asle, we see this with the second Asle and his two ex-wives, and we see this, of course, with Asle and his deceased wife, Alice, who met, fell in love, and who had this, in the grand scope of things, this very brief and fleeting but beautiful relationship until they moved apart from each other. The transitory nature of that crossing is both beautiful and sad, and it's especially sad if you don't believe in an afterlife. So there's no question why Asle feels so much solace in Christianity. In that conversion is the hope and faith that one day his line and Alice's line will one day cross again. The idea of two lines crossing and creating something new in that crossing, and then moving on in their own way, is central to this book. Septology goes one step further, as this isn't just a novel about individual characters' lives crossing, but this book is filled with doubling and doppelgängers who continue to cross each other's lives. So as you picked up on, and as I've noted throughout, a major theme in this novel is doubling. We have two different Asles, and actually we have way more than two Asles, especially in books 2 and 3, where we go back in time and we meet various different Asles at various ages. In the second book, the narrator Asle is having a bit of a flashback scene, and he's young and he's in art school, and while he's there, he meets this other young man who looks very similar to him and is just a couple of years older, and so he refers to him as the namesake, and we get scenes like this. At a table at the back, with his back against the wall by a window, there's a guy with long brown hair, and of course he's wearing a black velvet jacket and a scarf around his neck. Asle sees, and then Sigve says they need to go over and to say hello to the namesake. And Asle walks towards the namesake, who looks up, and Asle thinks that the guy sitting there looks like him. Yes, Sigve was right, he thinks, and Sigve and Asle go over to the table, and Sigve says he thought the two of them should meet, because they're not all that different, he says, and the namesake gets up and holds out his hand to Asle, and says, Asle, and Asle holds out his hand and says, Asle, and they shake hands. So, we're both named Asle, Asle says. Yes, so we are, the namesake says. And so it's all a bit confusing, but I should note here too that Asle isn't the only character in this novel who has variants of himself. There are other characters who share names, and in a kind of slant rhyme way, so many characters in this novel have names that are very, very similar. They sound similar, they look similar. Most of them begin with the letter A. We have Asle, Asle, Alice, Alida, Ostleek. But this really gets at one of the great questions of this book. What is the relationship between these different variants of the same name? How and why are these characters similar, and how and why are these characters different? What draws them together and what draws them apart? In some way, the various Asles act as a string of echoes. They're all variations of the same thing, as they all come from the same source. They're derivatives embodying the potentiality of identity. Like Robert Frost's famous poem, The Road Not Taken, both of the Asles represent two paths that this life could have taken. One which leads to despair and alcoholism, and the other which leads to, well, despair and art. And of course, while these two main Asles are quite different in the present, they're also very much the same. They've both lived very incredibly similar lives, and thus they each stand as a kind of mirror into which each of the Asles can gaze and see themselves, and see their own positive and negative potentials. And this is, of course, not an uncommon motif, right? This is something that Samuel Beckett does a lot. This is something that Jon Fosse's countryman Kjell Askelsen does quite a bit. But I think it's done so effectively here in Septology because Fosse pairs this theme of doubling with art and creation, and also to religion. There's a very strong Catholic element to this motif. Early on in the first book, there's a very long passage which sort of explores the mysticism of baptism, and Asle tries to reconcile with the Orthodox belief that one must be baptized in order to reach salvation. For Asle, this isn't really the case. Of course, you don't need to be dipped in water to be baptized. You can also be baptized in yourself, by the spirit you have inside yourself, the other person you have and are, the other person you get when you're born as a human being, I think. And all of them, all the different people, both the ones who lived in earlier times and the ones who are still alive, are just baptized inside themselves, not with water in a church, not by a priest. They're baptized by the other person they've been given and have inside them, and maybe through their connection with other people. This transformation seems like it's a much longer process than simply being baptized in holy water by the church, though that is for him an essential part of it. More broadly, it seems that baptism for Fosse is the first step in a very long process of discovering the self within yourself, the self behind the self concealed, to steal a line from Emily Dickinson, of finding your own potentialities and cultivating one of them. This doppelganger story is just so unique in how Fosse moves between these two identities, fluidly moving back and forth as their differences begin to melt away. And what I think is done so exceptionally well here is that there is no easy answer or easy key to understanding this doppelganger. The relationship between the two Asles and the many other Asles that we meet and the other characters who share doppelgangers is super complicated, and it's ever changing, as they really aren't the same person, though they kind of are. This is all to say that this isn't just a simple story of an older man looking back on his life and encountering younger versions of himself and realizing his mistakes, or something very Hollywood like that. But it's the story of a man encountering versions of himself and potential versions of himself, who are all quite similar to him, but are also rather distinct. And one way that Fosse really complicates this whole doppelganger thing is by adding another layer of distance between the narrator and us. You may have noticed that in some of the excerpts, Asle doesn't really do things, but he often sees himself doing things. That is, the opening line of this book is, "And I see myself standing there." This phrase, "and I see myself," is a constant refrain throughout Septology that not only introduces these flashback scenes, but it also happens in the present as well. Asle is a constant witness to himself, as if he's not fully in control of his life. This also occurs with the other Asle, as the phrase, "and I see Asle," occurs time and time again and is used to introduce a scene where the Björgvin Asle takes center stage. So our narrator Asle witnesses himself in the first person, also in the kind of third person if this other Asle is a version of himself, and he witnesses himself in the present tense and the past tense. This is all to say that in many ways Asle is a voyeur to his own life, which should raise questions concerning free will and questions about how memory works neurologically, psychologically, and spiritually. I noted earlier that Asle displays and sells his paintings at an art gallery in Björgvin, and this art gallery is owned by a man named Bear. And Bear and Asle are close friends, but so Asle needs to constantly drive into Björgvin to bring his paintings there to display them and to sell them. And at the beginning of the first book, Asle is doing just this. He's driving down into Björgvin, and while he's driving, he passes by this playground on the side of the road where he sees a young man with medium-length brown hair and a young woman with long black hair sitting on the swing set and talking to each other. And so he stops and watches them. I look at the young man sitting on the bench, not moving and staring straight ahead, as if not seeing anything, and I look at the young woman sitting on the swing. She too is staring straight ahead, as if at nothing. And why are they sitting so still? Why aren't they moving, I think? He on the bench, she on the swing, both just sitting there. Why are they just sitting there? Why aren't they talking to each other? Why are they completely still, motionless, like a picture, I think? Yes, they're exactly like a picture I might paint, I think. And I know that precisely this moment, precisely this picture has already lodged itself in my mind and will never go away. I have lots of pictures like that in my mind, thousands of them. And from just one thought, from seeing just one thing that it looks like, or for no reason at all, a picture can turn up. And this scene goes on, and it's just beautiful as Asle voyeuristically watches them as they begin kind of playing, as the young man begins pushing the young woman on the swing. And then he watches them ride the seesaw together. And if it's not already evident, these two young people in the playground are clearly a version of young Asle and young Alice. Young Asle always wears this black jacket and a scarf and has this medium-length brown hair, and Alice is always described as having long black hair. But again, what I find so fascinating here isn't that he's just remembering this memory as you would typically have in a normal book, but he's physically seeing them. He's physically seeing this scene play out in front of his eyes. Asle conjures up these memories and they spring to life in front of them and he witnesses them. He isn't thinking them, but seeing them. And there seems to me to be a very important difference between those two things. These memories are almost like paintings, as he's remembering them and then they come to life visually. This doesn't mean that they aren't necessarily real, but that they're entirely Asle's. This all, of course, mirrors the act of painting and the act of writing. It mirrors the act of creating art. And I think there's also something quite religious here as well, which I'll come back to. But Fosse has often talked in interviews and in some essays that I read by him that he doesn't plan out anything when he writes. Instead, he sits down at his typewriter and basically begins to hear the words of the story in his head, and he just types them out. This all reminds me a lot, of course, of the fiction of Gerald Murnane, because the ways in which these memories appear seems like Asle is exploring the topographies of his mind, to use Gerald Murnane's phrase. But this is all to say that within these conjured memories, it's nearly impossible to tell what is actually a memory, what is fictitious, what is a potential memory, what is a dream, what is a desire, etc. It isn't just memories that haunt Asle, but the potentialities of memories. And these two things seem to blur for Asle as much as they blur for us. We see this the most with the second Asle, whom the narrator Asle often sees in drunken escapades at this bar called the Ale House in town. But again, what makes these moments so fascinating is that it's entirely unclear if these are the narrator's Asle's memories, or if they're like potential experiences that he thinks he might have experienced had he not converted to Christianity and gave up on alcohol. But so Septology really is at its core an old man re-watching his life before his own eyes. But again, what I find so interesting is the way that it's told, the way these memories are framed. They do not appear ex nihilo to the reader, nor are they disembodied from the narrative voice, but they are physically conjured up by Asle and witnessed. Asle isn't just an old man reminiscing on his life, but an old man actively re-watching his life. Like a painter or a writer, our narrator Asle is creating these scenes in front of him and viewing them, which places, I think, art and creation right alongside memory. Septology is a religious novel. As I noted earlier, Jon Fosse converted to Catholicism quite late in life, after a life of going against the Church of Norway. And the character Asle in Septology had a very similar trajectory. But in tandem with the overtly Catholic themes that this book deals with, there is also always this more nebulous mysticism. Fosse has described his writing as mystical realism. And I think that this is a fantastic term to use to describe his writing. We see this mystical realism even just in the character names and the place names. Septology takes place in a world that is kind of our own, but just one step removed, right? It doesn't take place in Bergen, it takes place in Bibliography. However, while I like the term mystical realism, I think a term that better describes Septology specifically is mystical existentialism, or existential mysticism, what have you. Because while this is a religious novel, it is also very much about death and dying and trying to find meaning within that experience, within that ending. This latter theme, dying, is expressed most explicitly through alcoholism here, something that Fosse himself has struggled with and which he has likened to a kind of death. But not only a kind of death, but a kind of suicide. Catholicism seems to provide solace for both Fosse and Asle, but it doesn't seem like it fully provides the answers that Asle wants. And this is where that mysticism really comes in. Mysticism is fundamental to this book, as Fosse is always probing the mundane for meaning. It's similar, I think, to his countryman Karl Ove Knausgaard's probing of the mundane, though I do think that they come to different conclusions and they go about it in different ways. I'll touch on this connection to Karl Ove Knausgaard at the end of the video, because these two do have a history that's quite interesting. There is in Fosse's mysticism a fragile balance between emptiness and meaning, as Leif Zern, in his monograph on Fosse's theater, on Fosse's dramas, called The Luminous Darkness, which is a beautiful title and also could be used to describe almost all of Fosse's writing. But it's in this balance between light and dark, emptiness and meaning, silence and speech, that Asle in Septology searches for meaning and searches for God. For Asle, God isn't found in light, but found in darkness. I think that when I went to the art school, they said you should never paint with black because it's not a color, they said. But black? Yes, how could I ever have painted my pictures without black? No, I don't understand it. Because it's in the darkness that God lives. Yes, God is darkness. And that darkness, God's darkness, yes, that nothingness, yes, it shines. Yes, it's from God's darkness that the light comes. The invisible light. This idea isn't uncommon for religious people, right? That it's in moments of crises, in moments of darkness where your faith is the most important. But of course, Asle and Fosse, for that matter, aren't just religious, but Catholic. And Catholicism is really filled with mystery, as rituals like the celebration of the mystery of the Mass show. But alongside this Orthodox Catholicism, I think what we see here is this mysticism, this yearning for something that is hidden away, that which we cannot see and therefore cannot explain. God certainly falls into this category, but for Fosse, so does art, hence why he's exploring all of this through the metaphor of painting. I'll come back to this in chapter 6. But for now, let me just read this quick excerpt from one of Fosse's essays called Anagogue, which is a brilliant literary theory essay that, I mean, the whole thing is worth reading. But I just want to read this small paragraph. Literature wants to understand, but it doesn't understand. This is how literature's special uncomprehending comprehension comes into being. For literature cannot accept that it doesn't understand. Rather, it gives itself to the absent understanding and remains lonely and knowing in its uncomprehending comprehension. Literature becomes the secularized world's mysticism. The author becomes the secularized world's ascetic mystic. So while Fosse wasn't religious when he wrote that essay and is religious while writing Septology, I really think that these ideas remain relevant, and especially this idea of the author, the artist, being a kind of mystic, and of literature being lonely and knowing in its uncomprehending comprehension. I think all of this remains really true and really accurate for Fosse's philosophy that is expressed in Septology. A large part of this existential mysticism is explored through silence. Like I said at the beginning of this video, silence is really important for Fosse. It's a major facet of his writing style. But silence is also a fundamental problem with Christianity, or rather, it's a fundamental problem with those grappling with Christianity. I mean, every single theologian has attempted to answer the very basic question, why does God remain silent in the face of tragedy? Further, while the Bible for Christians is literally the Word of God, there is throughout the Bible and throughout Christianity a kind of distrust of words, of speech, going all the way back to the snake in the Garden of Eden and to the betrayal of Judas Iscariot. Psalm 109 begs, "My God, whom I praise, do not remain silent, for people who are wicked and deceitful have opened their mouths against me. They have spoken against me with lying tongues." That is, while the Bible is the Word of God, speech can be deceptive as people use it and use their words to lie. And we continue to question, why does God remain silent in the face of these lies? Asle really grapples with this, especially as he suffers. It's just as obvious as the fact that God's words are silent, I think, because they are. But that's completely obvious too, because God's language speaks silently from everything that exists. And this silence was first broken when the Word came into the world, when Christ came down to earth. Only then could God's word be heard. Yes, and thought too. But do I really believe this? I think, does it mean anything? I think, no, maybe not. But maybe a person can be hidden in Christ, in his word. And that's because there's no hope in God's great silence. But do I believe that? No, maybe not literally. But God's nearness isn't something I need to believe in, because the darker I am, the closer God is, I think. That's a fact. While Asle is secure in his faith, there are moments where it begins to falter and he begins asking these kinds of questions. Because throughout Septology, Asle is trying to come to terms with this paradox. God's silence and the fact that God is everywhere and therefore his word is everywhere. What's interesting to me is how Fosse deals with this religious problem through mysticism. He writes, again, in another brilliant essay in this collection called Negative Mysticism. So silence is perhaps the best way to preserve what we know deepest down. Perhaps this knowledge is silence itself, like the unspoken aspect of speech. And in that case, it is quite obvious that what we know deepest down may not be something we can pull out and argue for. It is much too silent for that. In a way, it is only something we know, how we could know it, and why we should know it, and all of that is not so interesting. The wisest thing we can do is probably to leave it indeterminate in the writing. For Fosse, mysticism and silence go hand in hand, as it's in the silence that God and the truth and meaning lay. I think that God has been staying hidden this whole time. Yes, it's like he shows himself by concealing himself in life, in things, in what is. Yes, in paintings too, of course. And maybe it's like the more God conceals himself, the more he shows himself, and vice versa. Yes, the more he shows himself, or is shown, you can say it either way, the more he conceals himself. I think, yes, God reveals himself by hiding, and it is in the hiddenness of God, God's hiddenness, that I can forget myself and hide myself, and only there, I think. And this is not something I can understand. There's nothing comprehensible about it. But it's when you understand that you can't understand God that you understand him. And isn't that so obvious that it doesn't even need to be said? Doesn't even need to be thought? So God's silence is difficult for Asle to comprehend and to face, especially as he's facing death. But he has cultivated a faith to reconcile this. And one way that he reconciles this, the primary way that he reconciles this, is through art. Art and God are the most powerful and mysterious forces in the world, and for Fosse, they are inextricably connected. This is expressed again and again throughout Septology, but it is ingrained into the very structure of the novel. Each of the 7 parts begin with Asle contemplating his painting of St. Andrew's Cross, and each part ends with him laying in bed and praying until he falls asleep. Each part begins with art, and each part ends with God. In his essay Negative Mysticism, which I referred to earlier, Fosse writes about this deeply personal connection for him between art and God. For the last few years, I shall begin there, it had occurred to me that, at least for me, there is a connection, to say it more or less imprecisely, between what some people experience in diverse religious fellowships. A few people also say that they have such experiences in and from nature, and what I myself can experience when I write. It is, in other words, the writing which has opened the religious aspects for me and turned me into a religious person. And some of my deeper experiences can, as I have gradually understood, be called mystical experiences. And these mystical experiences are linked to writing. It is writing, he goes on to explain, that pushed him out of his safe atheism. It is the writing which has transformed me and dissolved my smug safety and replaced it with a humble knowledge of being handed over to the other and placed in the other's hands. This idea of writing as a mystical experience is not only important to Septology, but to Fosse's entire bibliography. He has explained elsewhere that he never really plans out his books. He just sits down and begins to feel the scenes and the words come into his head and move through him, and he just types them out on the typewriter. He is just the vessel through which these words and these characters and these scenes flow through to get to the paper. This creative process is obviously something that is very difficult to explain rationally. And Fosse, just like actually Patrick McCabe, whom I reviewed recently, finds this process quite irrational, and he finds it just as mysterious and unexplainable as God. Neither can fully be explained with reason. How does imagination work? What compels someone to create art? And where does that creative process, that art, really come from? I think many of us could answer this question in our own way, and in fact, every single art movement has answered it in some sort of way. But for Fosse, there is something wholly mystical about this artistic process of creation. And I think that there is something quite profound at the heart of what Asle and Fosse as well really hyper-focuses on throughout this novel. That is, Asle searches for God by painting. He searches for God by mimicking, by creating. I mean, there's a reason why Septology is fundamentally about the creation of a single work of art, that of the St. Andrew's Cross painting. Art is, in many ways, for Fosse and for Asle, a means through which one attains communion with God, where they partake in capital C creation, its mimemic, its imitatio Dei. And of course, religion, especially Catholicism, is often made up of art. You can't walk into a Catholic church, often a work of art in and of itself, without seeing all of these stories artistically manifested on the walls of the church. Catholicism is made up of art because art is the truest representation of faith. Asle realizes this quite early on, and the text reads, "But everything leads to God, so that all religions are one, I think, and that's how religion and art go together. Because the Bible and the liturgy are fiction and poetry and painting, are literature and drama and visual art, and they all have truth in them, because of course the arts have their truth." Not only is art a means of attaining communion with God, but it's a means of attaining salvation in the very religious sense. Asle, especially in I Is Another, thinks a lot about how in his paintings what he's really trying to do is paint away his innermost picture. He's trying to get at his innermost self, and with each painting he comes closer and closer to that goal. But the innermost picture isn't actually a picture, of course, because the innermost picture doesn't exist. It just is, in a way, without existing. It is, but it doesn't exist. And somehow it's as if the picture that isn't a picture sort of leads all the other pictures and pulls them in, kind of, I think. But maybe I've now painted everything I can paint from this innermost picture of mine, I think. Maybe I've now, in a way, entered into this innermost picture and thereby destroyed it, I think. But this going into your innermost picture, yes, seeing it, well, that's probably the same as dying, I think. Yes, maybe it's the same thing as seeing God. And whoever sees God has died, as is written, I think. And I look at the snow that's covering the windshield. This metaphysical problem is really at the heart of septology. This connection between the self, art, and God. And there is, for Fosse, a great irony here at play, as fiction is in many ways a search for truth, for that which is hidden right behind the obvious or the mundane. He writes in a 1990 essay called The Novel and Its Great Irony. All good art comes into being in a relationship with death, through accepting the great mysterious secret of death and life. With its great irony, the novel confidently probes down into the secretive or the mysterious, seeking a meaning which always disappears. Small meanings are not enough for the novel. So the novel is always searching for the great meaningfulness, which we perhaps, with Meister Eckhart, may think of as the great differenceless emptiness, and which we perhaps may dare to call God. An empty significance which the novel points to through its absence. Death is not a mystery to be solved, but an inherent condition of the novel. And to me, the novel, to be obstinate, is constantly in search of the lost God. Again, this essay, like many of the others, is written quite early in his career, when he was perhaps still an atheist or perhaps just on the cusp of beginning the conversion process. But this seems to me to be super relevant to what septology is doing in its connections between art and God. This is really, I think, where Fosse's existential mysticism really helps Asle reckon with God's silence, because it's in this silence that Asle really learns to find solace. God is darkness, not lightness, and Asle explores God's shining darkness in a way that I think is just simply gorgeous. And I think that the humble Christians have thought about and pondered all of this, all these things for more than 2,000 years, how God can be all-powerful, be all-knowing, and be love at the same time. And I think that it's wrong to think like this, because in a certain sense, God isn't anything. He is a dark, shining nothingness, a nothing, a naught. And at the same time, he is also in everything that is. He is being, a distance that is also closeness, because God is both in and gone from the created world, which is outside the creator, outside of God, I think. All the space with our little planet where human beings exist is in a certain sense there so that God can exist. Because without human beings, God would not have become God, but something else instead. There is just something so existential about this whole passage, as this passage goes on for a couple more pages. As Asle seems to really be thinking about the relationship between God and his creation as a parallel to himself, Asle, and his creation, his paintings. While there is this linkage between art and God, art is never sufficient. Asle contemplates this again and again, and in one moment he's contemplating it while looking at his dog named Bragi. And then I look at Bragi standing there and looking at me with his dog eyes, and I think that dogs understand so much, but they can't say anything about it. Or else they can say it with their dog's eyes. And in that way, they're like good art, because art can't say anything either, not really. It can only say something else while keeping silent about what it actually wants to say. That's what art is like, and faith, and dog's silent understanding too. It's like they're all the same. No, now I'm getting in over my head with these thoughts. Again, we really see here, I think, Fosse's mysticism and his emphasis on silence as well. Even if it is through art that we can come closest to attaining communion with God, art still really can't say anything. It can only say one thing while keeping silent about that which it really wants to say. There's a ton more to be said about the connections in septology between art and God, as it is undoubtedly the main theme of this book, but I'll leave it there for now. So as I've noted throughout this video, and as I'm sure you've picked up in the many, probably too many, excerpts that I've read from this novel, that the prose of septology is wonderfully unique, but it's really worth pausing on and thinking through because, well, like any good book, the prose style heightens the thematic foci of the book. The two can't be separated as they're fully complementary, at least in what I would consider a good book, which is one of the reasons why I've read so many direct passages from septology in this video. Without the language, without the narrative voice, this book simply cannot exist. And I think that many people struggle with Fosse's prose, not because it's difficult by any means, because it's not, but because it is so unlike any other contemporary author's prose. The prose style has some notable features. It is minimalistic, it has an incredibly simple vocabulary and syntax, it includes no full stops, it's full of repetitions, and it's circuitous or looping, and because of all of this, it is reflexive grammatically and rhetorically. It's incantatory, it's dreamlike. And the effect that this has, I think, is that the prose really functions as a kind of prayer. Prayers are full of repetition. In fact, prayer itself is repetition, especially if you're doing a traditional Paternoster or Ave Maria, or another popular set prayer like that. And go read a breviary or a book of hours, and you'll see that the way that monks and nuns schedule their day is through performing certain prayers at certain hours. The prayers themselves give the day structure. And in fact, while septology does include a lot of actual praying, I think that a lot of the key phrases that are used again and again act like a kind of prayer. Phrases like, and I see myself, or and I see Asle, or I think, act as a kind of meditative refrain for Asle. He finds solace in this rhythm, in these rhythmic phrases, in the same way that monks and nuns do with their prayers. And I think it works like that for us, the reader, as well. I mean, I think this book just begs to be read out loud as if it is itself a kind of recitation, a kind of prayer. I noted earlier that at the beginning of each of the 7 volumes that make up septology, it opens with a variation of the exact same sentence. And I see myself looking at the paintings, the one with the 2 crossed lines, one purple and one brown. Well, this isn't the only passage that is repeated 7 times. At the end of every chapter, Asle lays down in bed and begins to recite to himself different prayers until he drifts off to sleep. Each time is slightly different as he puts the prayers in different orders, and I won't read out an entire scene because they're quite long and there's a lot of Latin in there as well, and I'm sure that there's no reason to read that out loud. But a good example of this ends, and I hold the brown wooden cross between my thumb and my finger, and then I say again and again inside myself, as I breathe in deeply, Lord, and as I breathe out slowly, Jesus, and as I breathe in deeply, Christ, and as I breathe out slowly, have mercy, and as I breathe in deeply, on me. And you'll note in that example, just above where I began reading, he recites a couple of very popular prayers, a Paternoster and an Ave Maria. And he drifts off into sleep in the middle of another one, leaving the prayer unfinished. And you'll also note the fantastic code switching, again, just before where I started reading between Latin and, well, in this case, English, which is, of course, something that Catholics traditionally had to do, especially if they wanted to say their Paternosters and Ave Marias in Orthodox Latin. But by ending each part of septology, each of the 7 parts of septology, with a prayer, I think it creates structurally a circle with the paintings. Each section begins with Asle gazing at his painting, and each section ends with Asle laying in bed praying. Again, art and creation on one side, and God, and prayer on the other. And again, the prose throughout Septology reads like a prayer. And one way that Fosse does this is by writing silence. Even when characters are speaking, the predominant speech throughout Septology is silence. What is left unsaid is almost always much more important than that which is said, as the characters seem unable to effectively communicate with words. Asle and Asle are like best friends, but they never really get past small talk. But I think that their friendship is a lot deeper than what it may appear on the outside. And this really goes back to Fosse's negative mysticism, or what I would call his existential mysticism. But the reason that I think this all acts like prayer is because the power of the Paternoster and the Ave Maria lays in its simplicity, in the fact that a child can repeat it just as an adult can. The simple diction, the mundane descriptions, the familiar prayers, all of this is meant to feel familiar, not foreign. Fosse can write in complex language if he wants to. He's translated Joyce and Kafka into New Norsk, for example. But he almost always chooses not to. Instead, he almost always chooses to write in the most ordinary, the most basic language possible. And this seems paradoxical, as what he's really interested in exploring are answers to some of the most complicated metaphysical questions there are, which philosophers, theologians, artists have explored and tried to answer for literal millennia. But while these questions are fundamentally complex, they are also the most basic question that every single ordinary human being has asked themselves. Every single ordinary human has grappled with these same questions. Fosse's ideas and his prose are profound not because of their complexity, but because of their simplicity, and for their ability to dig so deeply in that simplicity. Like the simplicity of his St. Andrew's cross painting, just two lines crossing in the middle, Fosse takes the ordinary, the simple, the basic, and probes it until he uncovers that which was hidden in plain sight. So Septology is an immense achievement. This is easily my favorite read of the year so far, and I suspect that we'll look back on Septology as a giant of early 21st century literature. I can see how some readers might not immediately jive with the repetitive and circular writing style. But if you're skeptical, read it out loud and give it 50 or 60 pages. And I think there's a good chance that you'll fall into the rhythm that it wants you to fall into, and it'll draw you in. It creates its own rhythm, and like I said in part 7, it really does act like a kind of meditation or a kind of prayer, though with this metafictional element that I think elevates this entire novel to a higher plane. But I think one thing that is so important about Septology is just how earnest it all is. Septology is a sincere and honest attempt to explore the mysteries of art, God, and death. And it revels in this mystery, in this unexplainable enigma. But at no point is it ironic or sarcastic or hopeless or insincere. Many of these things I struggle with not feeling when contemplating any of these questions, perhaps just because I read too much postmodern literature. But either way, Fosse's attempt to answer these questions is simply relieving in its earnestness, in its sincerity. Jon Fosse is often compared with his countryman, Karl Ove Knausgaard, for two main reasons, I think. One, because, well, they're the two very internationally famous male Norwegian writers of the time. And two, because Jon Fosse actually taught Karl Ove Knausgaard for a period of time. And it's talked about a little bit in his in Karl Ove Knausgaard's fifth My Struggle book. And as different as their writing styles are, I do think that there is a lot there to be compared between them. They're both fundamentally interested in ideas that are, by nature, beyond human understanding. Fosse's God and art, and Knausgaard's divine. Further, they're both obsessed by death. And of course, they've both written extensive essays on all of these different topics. But the reason I'm bringing up Karl Ove Knausgaard at the end of a review of Jon Fosse's Septology is because Knausgaard really seems to be, in many ways, the exact opposite of Jon Fosse in how they go about exploring these ideas. Knausgaard's maximalist, long-winded, overly sentimental, but hyper-self-aware and exuberant prose is countered by Fosse's terse, langsam prosa. Both authors, though, find all the meaning in the mundane, in the ordinary. They just go about probing the ordinary in different ways, and in ways that I can appreciate for different reasons. This comparison between Jon Fosse and Karl Ove Knausgaard, though, warrants its own video or article or monograph, really. Anyways, there's a lot more to be said about Fosse and about septology, especially as, like I said at the beginning of this video, this book eludes answers. Like when you're reading Gerald Murnane, the more you probe, the more questions you find rather than answers. And with that in mind, I simply hope that more people begin reading his works, especially septology, but his back catalog as well. I mean, so many of them are just so great. They are borderline sui generis in contemporary literature, which means that they might take a cognitive switch to really get into, but once you allow yourself to be swept away by Fosse's prose, well, there's really nothing else in modern literature like the experience. Anyways, thanks for watching.